Good morning, everybody. So today we're going to spend some time with the first chapter of our dear friend Jonah. And this is what we closed with last week. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, and go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. Whenever somebody comes to me and says, God spoke to me, I do not discount the fact that God speaks to people. But the question is the message, the purpose of the message, is it in line with Scripture? And most importantly, it's not the person that God chooses to speak through. We dare not look for the holiest and the righteous and expect God, because oftentimes he spoke through donkeys and sinners. But we find ourselves when somebody says the word of the Lord came. Jonah, it doesn't say how the word of the Lord came. He doesn't say, I got an email, a text message, a registered mail. I didn't get a package from God. It just says the word of the Lord came. Go to the great city of Nineveh, preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. If we take a look at this, expectation, reason, mission, we can add about 1,000 other questions we might have. And somebody calls me up and says, Pastor, I want you to do this. Sometimes I know immediately why I'm supposed to do it, okay? My wife says, Mitch, mow the lawn. If I get home and I can't see the house because the grass is that tall, I know exactly why she wants me to mow the lawn. Sometimes, though, somebody will say, are you going to paint the bathroom? Why? We just painted it a few months ago. I don't like the color. Now we've got to delve into a deeper question process. Is there something wrong with the color? Is it just this individual? So the word of the Lord came, go preach against Nineveh because its sin has come up against me. So God answers the questions that Jonah might have asked. Why me? Well, you're a prophet. Second, why go? Because their sin has come up against me. And he says, go preach against it. Now that's an interesting concept. Preach against it. On Sunday mornings, once in a while, somebody will come out and say, Pastor, you were talking to me. And it's an interesting concept, because I can't think of a single time in 40 years that I sat down and said, I'm going to write this sermon all about Daniel. But once in a while, I have noticed something going on, and it's usually not with a single individual. Because, by the way, if it's only a single individual that is struggling or working through something, I'm going to go meet with that person by themselves. But if I see something that is during COVID, I would come in, everybody had their masks on, and I would look at their eyes, and I could tell they're not sleeping. They're worried. They're hurting. Sometimes I could see tears. So that's when you say, we need to talk about this as a group. God says, I need you to preach against this whole city. Now notice God didn't say that there were good people there. He didn't say everybody was bad. He just said, I need you to go preach against the city. Luther said, clear, easy to understand, and full of comfort as this story is, it's been obscured by the intricate, innumerable, and silly questions of the Holy Fathers, as one can easily notice in the commentaries of all of them. We are not going to deny that the fathers were holy men, but none of them was free of this weakness of the flesh, which certainly is very bad, that they judged the saints on the basis of their position and their external acts, thinking all the while that nothing human or no human weaknesses dwelled in the saints. So we want to call him Saint Jonah. Why does he run away? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if we have an understanding or a thought process, I remember the first time that I met one of my idols. I was 6 or 7 years old. And we ran across one of the people that was on the afternoon PBS TV shows. And this individual was in line at Kmart, not acting like the person she was on TV. And I remember my mom saying, you just have to look away. You have to forgive her. And it was an interesting concept because I began to see this person on TV, and I thought that that is how she really was. And then when I saw her in person, and my mom says, we don't know what's going on. We don't know whether she had a bad day. We don't know if she's like this all the time. But all of a sudden, the reality between what I had imagined and what I perceived in person clashed. And as a child, you don't have the ability to work through them. And Luther says that a bunch of the Holy Fathers, and he's talking about the early church starting around the 300s and those who became bishops, etc., many of them elevated the individuals in the Bible that the stories are about to a sainthood before they died. And Luther said the problem with that is we can't see the true story then. So, if we take what the scriptures say, that Jonah was headed to Tarshish, notice he's in Joppa, Nineveh is over there, Tarshish is over there, roughly 2,500 miles or 4,023 kilometers from Nineveh. Now, Joppa's down here, and he had to go to Joppa, so we're not sure exactly where he was, but he goes to Joppa, a seaport, finds a ship headed that way. And you're like, okay, that's a little extreme. So where he was 400 miles, and he's going to go another 2,100 miles the opposite direction. Oops. Now, the question is, are you running towards something or are you running away from something? When we run towards something, it's because we see that we are, whatever it is, we discover that it is something we want, we desire, or we wish to protect. When we're running away, it's usually because what we see is less important than either us or what we were doing. Have you ever invited, when you were a kid, somebody to your birthday party and they said they couldn't come? And the question was, did they not want to come, or did they really have something that they felt was more important or their parents felt was more important? And we begin to play this game of how important am I to you? And so when Jonah runs the opposite direction, we're going to learn a little bit more about how he feels about the Ninevites, but he really was running away. Jeremiah 17, I have not run away from being your shepherd. You know, I have not desired the day of despair. What passes my lips is open before you. Do not be a terror to me. You are my refuge in the day of disaster. Jeremiah, who, by the way, originally told God, I just can't do it. And God says, no, I set you apart before you were born. And so Jeremiah says, look, I did not run away from you. I didn't want this day. This is not how I expected things to be in my life, but I did not run away. In Isaiah 33, the peoples flee at the thunderous noise. The nations scatter when you rise in your majesty. You'll remember in Moses, he goes up to talk with God, and it's lightning and thunder and all this noise. And the people say, look, don't make us go talk to God. You go talk to God. We'll be right here, and you can be the one who comes and tells us what God has to say. Is God so big and bad that we can't be near him? This comes down to God's will versus my will. I know what I want for my life. I know what I've got planned. I know how I expect all of this to come together. And God walks in and says, I want you to go to Nineveh. Sorry, God, I have other plans. And he says, no, I need you to go. If you think about most of the prophets, Moses said, I stutter. I'm not good at speaking. God says, fine, I'll give you Aaron. He'll be your spokesman. Timothy was told by Paul, I know you're young, but don't let him look down on you. You have a gift from God. Throughout, most of the prophets found themselves with an excuse why they shouldn't become a prophet. And God was right there to answer them. But that doesn't mean that they are ready to surrender their will, their plans, their dreams, their thoughts. So for the last few days, Nancy and I have had our house filled with 2 district presidents and the first vice president from Texas. And so we had a lot of talk about church and what's going on. And right now, people my age are getting ready to retire. A lot of them have already retired. So we have a huge number of retirements and we have very few individuals in the seminaries. And then you go talk to these individuals in the seminaries, and quite a few of them, by the way, will say, I'm willing to go anywhere as long as it's within 5 miles of my mother-in-law. I'm willing to go anywhere as long as I'm going back home. And the seminaries have finally realized that if they place those individuals where out here, that 2 years later, they just run home. And it just costs the church a lot of money and a lot of bandwidth. And it's because even though they said, look, I'm surrendering a lot to become a pastor. However, these are the things that I think are important. When we call people from the California district or Hawaii, we have a very, very narrow list of candidate pastors. And that's because most of them, when you call up, the first thing they say is, will you give me as much money as I need for a down payment? Will you buy me a house? But I want it to be my house. I don't want to live in a parsonage. How are you going to deal with in Hawaii? I'm going to need to go back 2 or 3 or 4 times a year to visit family. Are you going to pay for that? These are all the questions that we wind up asking. And they say, if I'll come and be your pastor, but I'm not going to give up my plans and my future. I was talking to a guy yesterday. He's getting ready to retire for the 2nd time. They're looking at retiring. They've got a house that they're going to sell, and then they're moving to this new place. And he said, the problem is we're trying to downsize, but we can't find another place that will hold all of our stuff and have all the rooms that we currently have, but is smaller. And this is what it is. I'm retiring. I'm going to downsize, but I want everything I had in that house in this house, but I want it to be smaller and easier to manage. In other words, we're not really giving anything up. Jonah says, I've got plans, God. And so and especially the Ninevites, asked me to go anywhere else, but not the Ninevites. Abraham, you're going to have so many kids, you're going to outnumber the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And a few weeks ago, Abraham and God are having this conversation, and Abraham goes, I'm childless, which is not true. He had a child by his wife's maid. He says, Eliezer of Damascus, his chief servant, is going to inherit everything. God says, no. And they began to go in through this. And then, of course, there's Lot and Sodom. God, how about if we find just a few good people? Will you save Sodom so that I don't lose my nephew? Moses, hey, God, I know you told me to speak, but you know what? I'm going to strike the rock. Peter, hey, Peter, I know you want me to work among the Gentiles, God, but I'm still going to hold to all of my Jewish traditions and customs. These are individuals who we hold up here and say they are the heroes of the faith. And Hebrews bears them out. They're all listed in the Hebrews chapters about the heroes of the faith. And yet they struggled to give up who they thought and what they thought their life was going to be when God called them. Imagine, Abraham is the classic. Hey, Abraham, I want you to go somewhere, but I'm not going to tell you until you get there. So just grab your stuff and head that direction, and I'll tell you when you get there. Jonah was terrified by at least 2 things: the magnitude of the task, in the kingdom which he was sent to, especially since God said their wickedness has come up before me. While it will be a few thousand years before Jesus is going to say, therefore, everyone who will acknowledge me before men, I will acknowledge them before my Father in heaven. But if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father in heaven. The principle still applies. That's from Matthew 10:33. And so we've got this. Jonah is looking at this and he's saying, okay, you're going to send me all by myself to literally preach to an entire city. And it's a big city, which we're told that took him 3 days to get throughout the city. Back when I was a kid, Billy Graham used to do his crusades. He would come to Mile High Stadium. They would pack the house. But imagine if he just showed up and stood on a box downtown on 16th Street Mall. He might get a few hundred people. But they would go a year in advance, start telling all the churches, we're going to ask you to fill the stadium for multiple nights. We're going to have George Beverly Shea sing. We're going to bring in guest speakers. Billy Graham's going to preach. We want to fill the stadium. We're going to ask, and then there's going to be a moment where everybody's going to come down if they want to, and they can give their life to Jesus. And yet it took a huge group to organize. And God says, no, Jonah, you're going by yourself. No backup team, no support team. It's just going to be you. And the second thing is, Jonah's like, and so God, you said that their wickedness has come up against you, yet you're asking me to go without a SEAL team to protect me. It's come down to a choice between the flesh and the spirit. And in our earthly condition, we tend to choose the flesh. Psalm 118, verse 6, the Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? The answer is, well, they can kill me. They can hurt me. They can imprison me. And are we really ready to forsake all, even die for our faith? And that's what we ask our confirmation students. Are you willing to forsake everything? Are you willing to even die rather than to give up your faith? And Jonah's like, I'm just not sure, God. You're asking an awful lot of me. And we don't know. Jonah's been a successful prophet up to this point, but we have no idea what he's faced and whether everything went so easily that he really just had no idea how it was going to be handled if he was out working with someone else. Now, God has promised a resurrection and a new heaven. That's what God promises. God says, when you die, you're going to be resurrected. And there's going to be a new heaven waiting for you where you're going to live forever. And the only question we need to answer is, are we ready and willing to surrender this life and all that we have, trusting in God's promise? In other words, when God says, I want you to go, do we go? Do we take those steps saying, well, it's one thing to say when I die of old age, I'm going to go to heaven. It's quite another to say, I will boldly step forward, placing my life in jeopardy because whether I live or die, it's going to be okay. I mean, that's what we are asked to say. And sometimes we say it. The question is, how do we feel when we say, I'm willing to forsake all? Daniel 3:16 and 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually were told, if you surrender God right now and worship my gods and bow down when I tell you to, I won't throw you into the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not going to do it. Our God can save us, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to do it. They stole all the power that Nebuchadnezzar had over them. Because they said, God can save us. What if he doesn't? We just get to go to heaven and we'll be with him. So either way, we win, you lose. This is a no-lose proposition for us and a no-win proposition for you. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. And, somebody always says, hey, if this happened, what would you do? And the answer is, my hope is I would do the following. Because none of us know what we would really do until that moment arrives. And that's one of the struggles we have, because we have all the best intentions. I have a feeling the day before, Jonah was like, God challenged me, pushed me. I'm ready to go. You know, after my last things, I've got this, God. So just tell me where you want me to go, and I've got it. And the next day, he goes, I need you to go to Nineveh. And Jonah goes, nope. Nope, not going to do it, God. Because we're always willing to go and do, but then a moment later, when we really think about it, again, going back to pastors and calls, we had a couple of churches that put pastors, they called the pastor and they said, would you be willing to consider a call to Hawaii? And by the way, the answer we usually get is, oh man, that would be great. So then a few weeks later, they called to set up an appointment to interview the pastor and the wife to answer any questions. And the guy quite often says, I'm sorry, my wife says I can't consider a call to Hawaii. In other words, I was excited about it because all I could see was beaches and palm trees, and we're all driving Ferraris and living in mansions right on the ocean. And then I talked to my wife and she said, no, we're going to have to leave family. I don't want to do that. And so they removed their name off the call. The question is, can we, or are we willing to actually step forward boldly and answer God and believe that if he really is talking to us, and that's the other thing, was it God or a pepperoni pizza that told me to do this? If we really believe that it's God talking, are we willing to take that step? Each of us has something or someone that we would be willing to give our lives for. Call it love or patriotism or justice. It allows us in a moment of time to do something that we would normally never consider. Bravery, heroism, sacrifice, the words are empty compared to the act itself. But what are the things that we would be willing to die for? What are the things that we would be willing to sacrifice all of our dreams and our plans in order to take care of it? Whether it is something that came upon us or something that we believe that God handed us. And when we know what those things are, how can we at some point begin to see beyond and say, I really believe that God will take care of me if their wickedness has come up before me. This is a Hebrewism. It's a figure of speech. We are personifying God. Of course, God knows they have sinned and the level of their sin. It's not like God was on his throne one day and all of a sudden somebody came and said, oh, those Ninevites have really gotten in. God goes, oh, I should have never left him alone. It's not what's happening. When he says their sin has come up, of course it did. And what he's simply saying is, I know. But is it their level of sin or that God knows their hearts are ready to believe? See, Jeremiah was told, you will preach, but nobody's going to listen. Jonah isn't told that. And because he was successful, we know that God knew that. And so we know Jonah, well, we know that he would be successful. But Jonah doesn't know it. We're going to talk about in a minute whether God should have told him. But think about this. Did God tell 48 prophets that day, I want you to go to Nineveh. I want you to go to Joppa. I want you to go to Tarshish. I want you to go to, in other words, was this 48 prophets going to 48 cities? Or did he say, Jonah, I need you to go because their sin has come up against me, and yet at the same time, I know their hearts are ready for the gospel? Do you think God should have told Jonah that he would be successful, that he wouldn't die or be imprisoned? Would that have made a difference? Hey, Jonah, I need you to go to Nineveh, and everything's going to be okay. I promise to protect you. Nothing's going to happen to you. And by the way, when you're at the end, you're going to be known for saving an entire city. Do you think God should have told him that? This brings up another question. Is this about the Ninevites or is it about Jonah? Or both? Is God able to use various events in our life to encourage and strengthen us, at the same time doing good to somebody else? All of a sudden he says, I know what you're capable of. I know it's going to be hard. I'm going to challenge your faith. I'm going to take you out of your comfortable place because someone needs to come over here and do what I need done. You need a boost, and they need me. And so I'm going to send you in my place. Because we tend to think about this all about the Ninevites, or we think about it as Jonah. Did God choose Jonah because Jonah needed something as well as the Ninevites? Martin Luther questions the term Tarshish, by the way, and this is one of those things where Luther had way too much time sitting in a castle with nothing to do except write. And so he says, I see 2 Chronicles 9:21. The king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants, etc. In 2 Chronicles 20:36, and building ships to go to Tarshish. In Psalm 72:10, may the kings of Tarshish and of the isles bring tribute. Luther believes instead of fleeing to a specific city, he was so terrified that he found a ship, and any ship that would take him in the opposite direction of Nineveh. He says, I don't think he was necessarily going specifically to Tarshish, the city. I think he was headed away. Now, there's about 12 different translations, and some of them, by the way, include the words ours does, where it says pretty much that Jonah set out for Tarshish. And about half of them, the Hebrew, they say, says, no, it's more like he's headed toward Tarshish. And I'm not enough of a Hebrew scholar, and the stuff I read yesterday didn't clarify to me which is the better Hebrew translation. Genesis 28:16, surely God is in this place and I did not know it. That's Jacob. One theory is that while the Psalms say over and over again that God is everywhere, even the most devout assume God was relegated to certain places. So if Jonah leaves where he is at and goes the opposite direction, God, since he expects Jonah to go to Nineveh, God's going to go to Nineveh, and he's going to be surprised when Jonah doesn't show up. In other words, God is, he's everywhere, but I can hide from him. And God's not going to know that I'm going the opposite direction until it's too late. Okay? How do you deal with God's omnipotence, his omnipresence, and not living in a sequential time flow like we do? If God is truly everywhere, and he is everywhere in the past, present, and future at the same time, what does that mean for us when we want to be alone or we want to hide? Did Jonah think about this? When I wanted to be alone, I would go in my closet. And I had a pretty good-sized closet. My mom knew I was there because there was no way out of my room except to walk right past her. And so I would go in my closet, and then after a little while, my mom would come and open the closet door and say, are you done yet? Real simple. My sister was the one who would leave the house. And she would go find various places in the neighborhood to hide. Well, my mom knew where most of those places were, and so she just would wait. But we all knew, and my mom knew where she could find us. Does God know where we're hiding? Because in the Psalms, David says, even if I were to go to the far ends of the sea, even if I were to go to the highest height or the deepest depths, God, you are there. And Jonah would have known these things. So what is actually going on in his head when he simply says, I'm going to get on a boat and go the opposite direction? Does he really think he's going to get away? In verse 9, Jonah says, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. It seems to be a statement accepting that he understands that God is all-powerful and is everywhere. Maybe Jonah didn't think he'd actually get away, or he was hoping that God would just find somebody else. Oh, gee, Jonah, since you happen to be in Tarshish, which is 2,500 miles away, I guess I will find another prophet to do my work. Maybe Jonah didn't think he would actually get away. He was hoping that just God would find somebody else, or maybe Jonah knew God would be angry and either believed that God would forgive him or he was willing to bear the punishment for running away. Sometimes we are. Sometimes we're actually willing. I'll put up with whatever punishment because I'm not going to do this. I can't do this. And so in this, we see Jonah. Whatever's going on in his head, says he goes down to the port, jumps on a boat, and heads the opposite direction. And I have to assume, by the way, that it was not a cheap boat. In other words, he's willing to expend whatever he needs to get away. And he's going the opposite direction because he just says, I'm not going to do it. But the Lord hurled a great wind. Now, Jonah is a prophet of very few words. So much has obviously happened that he didn't write down. The word of the Lord came to me. He said, go to Nineveh, and because the sin has come greatly against it, but I chose to go down and instead to Joppa, grab a ship, and head the opposite direction. Now, I'm pretty sure there was an awful lot of discussion and things that went on, but Jonah skips all that. Not only is Jonah terrified in his heart, soul, and mind now, he also has reason to be terrified in his body because of this great wind. And so he's a man of few words, but the words he chose for his book are pretty clear. And so he's gone down below and he's sleeping. and this great wind comes up. And I don't know, maybe Jonah didn't get seasick. Or maybe he was down there and he would sleep for a few minutes, and then he would get up and throw up, and then he would sleep for a few minutes. Because being in the belly of the ship doesn't necessarily mean that he was immune to seasickness. But this great wind comes, and so now it's a spiritual, emotional, and physical danger. Now, if you were on the Titanic or the Hindenburg or in New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina or in the 1906 earthquake and fire, how much faith would you have? If you were standing there in the midst of the earthquake in San Francisco, or you were on the Hindenburg or on the Titanic, or you were standing in the streets of New Orleans as the water rose, how much faith would you have? And how would that faith manifest itself? What would be your expectations? There's that old joke of the guy, who's on his roof and the helicopter comes to pick him up and says, here, we're ready. Nope, God's going to save me. And the boat comes by. Nope, God's going to save me. And all those, finally, he dies and he goes to heaven and God says, I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter. It's that old joke, but there's truth. What are your expectations about how God is going to provide for you and how you're going to be delivered? What would you need to survive? In other words, when everything around you is literally falling down, what do you need to survive? 2 weeks ago, when we thought a tsunami was coming, did you look at your cupboard and say, I got enough food for a week? Did you fill a few buckets so that you could at least flush the toilet or do a simple bath? Did you make sure that you had your phones fully charged? In other words, what are the things that are important to you that you say, if a disaster is going to strike, here's how I'm going to prepare? What is your role in disasters? And what is God's role? How do you balance what God is supposed to do and what you are supposed to do? Because this is what Jonah, not only is Jonah faced with it, but we are. Because we have to ask, what is God's role when terrible things are about to happen? Jonah remained in the faith. The storm inside him was greater than the storm outside. And it is only by faith that he is able to say what he says to the crew. We're only spectators of this event, but most of us might be able to imagine what it would be like to know that what was happening to the ship and the crew was because of something that we had done. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. To understand that what is happening is a direct result of us disobeying God. And it's no longer just us that might be bearing the punishment, but a bunch of other people as well. If we were Jonah, would we have written down all the doubts, pains, fears we were experiencing? Would we discuss the possible temptation that was pushing us to pretend we didn't know that we knew? In other words, when they started screaming and crying, would we just stand there and go, wow, I have no idea why this is happening? The storm was worse than most storms because even the sailors who plied this route over and over again were afraid. What's most interesting is they believed this storm was caused by somebody's sin. I want you to just think about that. Okay? When was the last time that you were somewhere when something happened and you turned to the person next to you and said, this is all your fault? And you mean it. They don't know whose fault it is, but they're pretty sure it's somebody's fault. Now, there have been a few high-profile accidents lately that seem to point to one person's sin causing a lot of pain and anguish. Sometimes it is so clear that one person or a group of people are responsible for the tragedy, a car accident, plane crash, negligence in construction, manufacturing. But would we think a storm was caused by someone's sin? When the tsunami was threatening us a couple weeks ago, did we actually sit and think, oh, those Russians, they're just doing this to be mean to us? Did we actually think that someone somewhere, see, it's a whole different thing when we had the ballistic missile threat a few years back, because that was a person who theoretically had pushed the button to launch the missile. Whole different matter. But when it's a hurricane, when it's a tsunami, when it's a volcano, do we actually think that God did this because my neighbor sinned. Now, Jonah was fast asleep. This sleep is driven by anxiety, fear, lack of self-care, and other physical and emotional draining events. The Hebrew word, by the way, here conveys this. The Hebrew word means dazed, stunned. He's not just asleep. He's not sleeping the sleep of the righteous. He has exhausted himself so badly that he just can't stay awake. His whole body has shut down. This isn't just him being tired night-night. This is him saying, I just can't do it anymore, which is why the moment they set sail, he went below decks, found a place, and curled up. Psalm 104:32, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He who looks at the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. This is the God Jonah is running from. This is the God who Jonah is feeling the wrath of, which is why his sleep is not rest. It is the weight of the universe literally crushing him. And he doesn't know what to do. He does, but he's unwilling to do. The mariners were afraid and each cried to his God. Now, these mariners, these sailors, are not atheists. They have a bunch of gods, and they called upon a God, their personal God. All tradesmen had a patron God who they called upon for protection. While they were not believers, they had a sense of right and wrong, something that was beyond themselves. Might have been mysticism, but it also could have been the thing that Paul ran into in Mars Hill when he found the statue to the unknown God. We believe there's something out there. We believe there's something beyond us. We're calling upon whatever that is to make it known, itself known to us and to save us. Because as good as sailors as we are, as fine a ship as this may be, we aren't going to survive unless. And that's when they come to Jonah. What are you doing sleeping? Arise and call on your God. While the sailors are calling upon their various gods, they wake Jonah up and tell him to call on his God. They never know which God or God might answer them. They want to cover all their bases. So it's like, okay, let's make sure we've got the list. We know of at least 35 gods. Have we prayed to all 35 gods? And by the way, you over there, which God are you praying to? The number of times people who aren't church members call up and want to make a donation. And they say, I just want to make a donation to your church. And we don't mean to be ungrateful, but we're like, well, that's wonderful. Why? Well, my aunt or my mother or my grandmother's in the hospital. So if you make a donation to the church, you think God will have mercy on your mom or your grandma or your aunt. And they don't know how to answer that. But they're looking for a way to bribe God. They're looking for a way to make God do for them what they want done. And so the easiest way is to write a check. Or maybe they'll show up in church. Or maybe they'll say a prayer. In all the movies, every time the plane is crashing or the bad things are about to happen, somebody always says, let's pray. And I was talking to the guy who's the first vice president of the Texas district. And I haven't seen Greyhounds yet with Tom Hanks. But he's a history buff like I am. Said it's very realistic. But it's interesting because one of the things he points out is at the beginning and the end, toward the beginning and the end of the movie, Tom Hanks says a prayer. And it's Luther's morning and evening prayer. He says it's slightly changed from our version, but it's obviously Luther's morning and evening prayer. And this is one of the things that there are no atheists in foxholes, they say. And so when we are threatened, when we are in danger, we suddenly find ourselves willing to pray. And so the sailors are saying, get up. We don't know who you are. We don't care. Just get up and call upon your God because we need all the help we can get. Now, faith rejects no one, but it also trusts no one. Faith depends on God alone. And so when they wake everybody up and they're saying, everybody pray, everybody, what we're seeing is a panic. But faith doesn't have its root in the people and what the people are doing. It's not the number of people praying. It's not the words of the prayer. It's not the bribes that the prayers are suggesting. Faith depends on God. And so the connection has to be someone who says, I know that God is watching, and I know that God is hearing me. And God knows who I am, and I know who He is. Prayer petitions. Forward this email, or you will be in peril. The 99th monkey. All these things that people use, but it doesn't do any good. It's like me. If I'm walking through a crowd and somebody is yelling, Michael, 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 my name's not Michael. So if I hear somebody calling Michael, I'm not going to listen. But if I hear Mitch or Pastor, it's always great when we go to the pastor's conference and some kid comes running in and says, Daddy. And we all look. Or we're at a group somewhere and a bunch of pastors are having dinner and somebody says, Pastor. And we're like, yes, This is one of those things, but we also know that we don't tend to respond to names that aren't ours or to descriptions that aren't ours. Some people think if we can gather enough support, God will have to give us what we need. If I can get 4,000 people to sign my online prayer petition, God will have to heal my mother. I don't know what we think we're bribing God with. And that completely nullifies the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done. But it is the way that it works because we think, God, I know I haven't done right. I know that I have often. So tell you what, God, I'm going to make up all the prayers. This is, remember Zacchaeus? He meets Jesus, and the first thing he does is he pays everybody back, not just what he took from them, but he pays them back with interest. And the question is, did he do that out of sanctification because he knows he was saved and now he is responding out of love, or did he do it out of fear, hoping to make up for it so that God would love him? And we'll have to get that answer later. But when we are trying to do something, we have to ask, why are we doing it? Come, let us cast lots. Prayer then gives way to panic, okay? We've prayed. The wind is just getting worse. Now, if we can identify whose fault it is, then we can save ourselves. Now, would you be willing to cast lots? What if you drew the short straw? Are you sure it's going to be accurate? Are you sure that everyone else is a greater sinner than you are? What if, by the way, you draw the short straw and you're pretty sure that you're innocent? Or you draw the short straw, but you know that that person really is guilty. And just because we identified who's the sinner, does that mean that we're going to be able to somehow save everyone? Works are rated by God on the basis of faith. This is why God approves someone's work in some cases, but disapproves the same work done by someone else in another case. Okay? It's not the work, it's the faith. All works done in faith are accepted by God. Works that are done for other reasons are not accepted. We often think things should be fair, but there are extenuating circumstances, unknown, and some pretty extensive baggage that causes a different response by God, who, by the way, knows all things, to different prayers, works, and thoughts. 5 people can line up and do the exact same thing, and God says, this one has done it out of faith, and I accept it. We don't know the heart, but God does. I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven. This is Jonah's answer. The confession of sin begins. Jonah says that he fears the God of heaven, who's angry with him and whom he is foolishly trying to escape. His fear, by the way, is out of reverence. This is not, I'm afraid of him, although it's a little bit, but it's a reverent fear. The truest worship of God does not consist in works, no matter how great and holy they may be, but in faith and respect, fear. That's the catechisms. Now, Psalm 19:19. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. Jonah's intention was to say, I fear the God of heaven, namely, I'm a true worshiper of the true God. In the midst of his sin and rebellion, Jonah testifies to God's power. He no longer is running away, but he stands ready for whatever is about to happen next. And what's about to happen next is pretty intense because of who Jonah has decided to become. The sea grew more and more tempestuous. Jonah's confession was not enough to calm the sea. Although Jonah alone was the cause of the storm, nevertheless, all these men who were with him were in equal danger of life and were suffering the same punishment as Jonah. And Jonah has come to understand and accept this. On account of Achan, who had stolen something against God's orders, the Lord afflicted the people of Israel in a terrible way. That was Joshua 7. In James 5:17, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth, which means for all those years, nobody, whether they were righteous or not, they got rain, which means there were no crops. Everybody suffered. James also says, therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. So what to do? If Jonah goes overboard, will the wind and the waves subside? If he doesn't, will everybody die? Is it possible that someone else is also guilty of a terrible sin? So that even if Jonah goes overboard, there's somebody else who's responsible, that they don't know who's responsible. Jonah answered them, pick me up and throw me into the sea so it may quiet down for you. For I know that I'm to blame for this violent storm that is against you. And we're going to leave off there because this is how we know that Jonah has finally understood what's going on and why it's going on. And he says, just pick me up and throw me in. And I'm not going to spoil it, but I am. But I want you to think this week. These hardened sailors say no. Because they said, we do not want to be responsible for your death. So in the midst of all of this, as they're trying to figure out who's wrong, they're praying. Now it comes down, somebody has finally stepped up and says, it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Throw me over, and you guys will be fine. And they turn and say no. And I'll let you figure out why. Go in peace, serve the Lord in gladness, and we'll see you next week.